It's good to see you all. It's so nice when you send your messages. I'm reading them all. I'm trying to reply to some of them. I've been in conversation with a couple of you, and everyone has seen those comments and exchanges. Hamis, I'm glad you enjoyed the presentation. And as posted within the chat, there are some reflective questions that I'd like to put to you now. The chat is the way to do this, I believe. And if you have some thoughts, please type them in, and so we can think about them together. So my first reflective question for you all is this: what are the benefits of following a linear syllabus? What are the benefits of following a linear syllabus? I'm going to type that into the chat right here. So please feel free to comment in the chat. I think Mia has started by saying that it's predictable. You know what's coming next. Hedvig has added that it helps guide teachers with less experience. Assem has said that it's clear. I'm sure you can read this. I'm just sort of trying to bring them to life a bit by reading them out. Mia adds that some students like this element of control and being able to plan ahead. Certainly true, and that extends very often to managers within the school, parents. The whole sort of ecosystem of education is used to the idea of knowing what's coming next. Objectives are controlled, everything's put in a frame.
Look, if I may just say, share my opinion as well. It's also the fact that language exponents are laid out for you as well, right? So as a teacher, I mean, being a Dogme teacher, you kind of improvise. You need to do the needs analysis, right? You pull out this language and you decide what language exponents you would like to focus on. So when you follow a syllabus, a linear syllabus, it's all laid out for you. It's ready for you, right?
Yeah, certainly agree. And I've been, thanks for that, Gabby. And I've been asked to encourage you all to raise your hand and speak if possible. So if you press the raise hand button, you'll be able to give us your thoughts by speaking. I'd love to hear your voices. Bottom right of your screen, I think. Press raise hand.
Yeah.
Hi, Maria.
Hi. Very interesting, very interesting. Well, plenty of food for thought. What I would like to say is that, the linear methodology, what I find is, okay, it's what's everybody, well, the majority of schools, and when you follow a national curriculum, you have to stick to. But when it comes to English, teaching English as a foreign language, of course, I think we have more leeway and we can just be much more adventurous with our groups. My point of view on linear teaching is that, of course, I find it restrictive, limited. Um, Very often, I don't think the students' inventiveness is not taken into consideration, or even autonomy, and I should say that it restricts. There are lots of restrictions, and of course, what I believe in just students being spontaneous and enjoying the lessons, and of course, to me, it lacks a spontaneity, and also because everything is fixed, it's in a frame, and it's completely controlled. But this idea of just going, following your own path or following different paths, I quite like it.
Yeah, thanks for that, Maria. And I think for me, the more I think about it over the years, the relevance to language teaching is so strong. That spontaneity is desirable I would say in all subjects, at all levels of education, we want to give students a chance to be creative, and everyone can be if you give them that chance. But I think the point about language is that it's inherently unpredictable. Conversation is unpredictable. As soon as we start talking to someone in a non-controlled environment, we don't know quite what they're going to say, what other people are going to say, and we don't quite know where our own thoughts are going to go. So of all the subjects to control in this way, it strikes me that language is one of the least appropriate. Okay, so there's a nice comment from Laura or Laura, sorry if I'm mispronouncing any names, who says that linear or linear syllabus gives us a secure path. So that's a positive. And someone previously has said that it can be good for teachers with less experience. Laura says linear is a secure path, but almost boring. And mostly it usually doesn't present a real information gap. There's no real reason to communicate. I think that's a great point, Laura. Any activities that we can develop in class where there's a real information gap are beneficial because they bring everyone to life, and they can be quite simple setups. It might be as simple as you setting up a scenario where you give students a little bit of detail about something that happened to you, saying, for example, you wound up really late for something yesterday, and then they have to ask why. That's not a brilliant example, but the point there is that it's real life, it's you, and they can start to engage with what the possibilities were and use language in a real way.
Okay, we have a couple of hands up.
Can you manage that, Hedvig? Is that
yes,
okay?
Yes,
lovely. Thank you.
Mia, I think you can start sharing your opinion with us.
Okay, and sorry for the barking in the background. That's the dogs here in the garden.
Okay, Unplugged.
I just wanted to draw another analogy to running. You might have guessed that I'm a runner, and I find that a linear syllabus is very much like running 10 miles straight ahead. You see what's coming, and you know the track. You've done it before. You can estimate when you'll arrive, and it has its advantages. I mean, you can pretty much run on autopilot, but it's also terribly boring. And I find that when you do it this way, it always seems so much longer. And that's the advantage of a spontaneous syllabus. You take turns so often that you never really know where you're going until you make the turn. And it just makes it so much more exciting. And in the end, you come home with so many more impressions.
Lovely. And, I think our concern for our students' levels of interest in class also need to be addressed to ourselves as teachers. We need to exercise self-care, as they say these days in the field of well-being. We all know, like we've all been school kids at one point in our lives. We all know what it's like to be in the classroom when a teacher is bored, and we can spot it very easily. Kids are not silly, learners are not silly, and they know when the teacher themselves is bored because they've done this 5-kilometer run on the same direction every day for the last few years. So, our level of interest in what we're doing is also critical, and it will create a dynamic where we can bring our students to life. I'm just looking at some more. Okay, so I'll let Hedvig, if you can maybe bring.
Right, Luminita is raising her hand.
Okay, hello everyone. I just wonder how can we adjust, for example, project-based learning into the linear syllabus? Is there a possibility to do that? You see, I have been applying these projects to my classrooms, and it was quite a successful, let's say, opportunity for the students. How could it be just mixed up so that it has vivid results? Thank you.
Thanks, Luminita. That's a great question. I'd like to, I'm sure we'd all like to know what your projects are. I think one thing you can do when you use something like a project where perhaps the language outputs are more unpredictable is to identify what you think is appropriate for the level, which is where, as Gabby was saying, we need to use our own judgment there, and then locate them in the syllabus. It may, for example, be that a project-based activity generates a lot of language which relates to themes in the course book or in the syllabus, but themes which you've already covered or which you're going to cover later. You can use the syllabus as a kind of roadmap, but you don't have to follow it all the time. You can point out that these are things that have already been learned or are going to be taught later. So that's one way to blend the two. The syllabus gives you a sort of reference point for the emergent language.
Okay, and we also have Anna Sophie raising her hand. And
hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi, and Sophie.
Hi. Really enjoyed the session. Look, my question's also about, it's been more about teacher training, because I was thinking, I think, you know, the idea of the linear syllabus in the course book, yes, it is easier for less experienced teachers, and that's great. But I also think that, you know, some teaching contexts don't really lend themselves to course books. So I was thinking, let's say, if you teach groups of migrants or newcomers, let's say in an English-speaking country, people may have so many different types of needs that I don't think any course book really could help really deal with all those needs. So my question to you, like, is how do you prepare teachers to deal with emergent language? Maybe teachers who may not have the confidence to analyze language on the spot. Do you have any tips to help, let's say, maybe less experienced teachers?
That's a great question. I don't have a kind of magic bullet answer to that. Where this conversation always leads, and it's a conversation that I often have, it's a thought process I often follow, is the sooner in the teacher training process we can introduce the idea of emergent language and emergent themes as an important and necessary element within the language classroom, the better. I think if we prepare teachers purely to essentially do versions of PPP, to do very tightly planned lessons which deliver the linear syllabus, if that's the only way they've been trained, then yes, it's very hard to expect, especially less experienced teachers, to be more responsive and to be more spontaneous as teachers. But if we can introduce that earlier in the teacher training process, within the kind of broader culture of education, then I think it's something that inexperienced teachers can do. And I think there are strategies that you can teach them. I know there are very strong sort of cultural elements which make it hard in some contexts for a teacher to say that they don't know something. But it can equally be powerful for a teacher to say, you know what, I don't know the answer to that question. I'm going to research it overnight and we'll look at that together tomorrow. Partly because it models what we want our learners to do, which is to look stuff up, think about it, and reflect about it, reflect on it. So I think there are strategies that less experienced teachers could use, but I think they need to be validated in our teacher training.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Thank you, Anna Sophie. And we have Gassam or Gaysam.
Yes, Gassam.
Oh.
Thank you.
Hi, Gassam. I know you've been waiting.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk. Just I want to say that the linear syllabus is easier for a novice teacher novice teachers, let's say. But for experienced teachers, I think that teaching is a philosophy, it's an art, rather than following syllabus. So I once read that a good teacher is someone who is ready to be foolish if that will make the students learn. So let's say these are theories, but in practice, everything changes. And as the teacher is aging and getting experience, I think many things are changing. I don't know whether you agree with me or not.
That's a lovely quote about needing to be foolish sometimes. And it makes me think of situations outside the classroom when just in our everyday lives, especially if we're trying to help children to learn something, where we quite naturally, pull faces, maybe deliberately do something wrong, either to make them laugh or to show that we're not perfect either. There are all kinds of things that we do naturally when we're teaching people kind of outside the classroom. And that strikes me as a great strategy. I love the way that you described teaching as something that we learn to see, or we should learn to see as an art as we get older, that we learn to be more responsive. What I would like to see in education is an acceleration of that, so that teachers aren't left to discover this for themselves almost over the course of many years as teachers, but are encouraged to explore it earlier, so that elements of this are part of our formational training. And the idea that we may need to be, it's a funny thing teaching. And we can all remember this from our very early days. I felt it at the start of this session today, and it's just the nervousness of being in front of other people and of presenting any kind of content. And I don't think that goes away, Gassem. So it's a very exposed profession. We're there on view in front of people from the first lesson we teach until the last. And I think one way we try to protect ourselves from feeling exposed is to control as many of the variables as we can. I think it's a natural human response. Certainly it took me years to learn to relax more. But again, I think if we can introduce that as an essential component of teaching, the idea that it's an art, that it's flexible, that it's responsive earlier in the teacher training curriculum, then it would be better, and we could accelerate what some of us learn through years of experience. It was a long answer, Gassem. It was a great
thanks. You're wonderful. Thanks.
Thank you. My next question, because there were three key questions we've already discussed, really, which is, what are the drawbacks of following a linear syllabus? And I think in discussing that first question, what are the benefits, we've naturally uncovered some of the drawbacks. And I think, what we can gather from all the contributions is, yes, there are benefits, maybe particularly at the start of a teacher's career, maybe in certain contexts, but there are drawbacks as well. And I would say, the more flexibility we can find or create in our classrooms for teaching that allows us to move away from that linear syllabus, the better. If we go off the linear syllabus, we're not going to discover a whole new language. We're not going to find verb forms that have never been seen before. There are no monsters away from the syllabus. There is just a more intuitive, more spontaneous kind of interaction, and a different kind of decision making as teachers in terms of deciding where we highlight a form, what we write down, and what we feed back to the students. In other words, I think we can do both, but the educational system generally, and I've seen this in many countries, favors the linear syllabus. And so as teachers, we need to find the space that we can in our classrooms. There's a nice comment there from Laura. Again, maybe we should tailor the lesson to fit the group of students we're working with. I think that's something we always want to do. One very good way of doing that is to listen to them, is to give them the chance to talk, or give them motivating writing activities or interaction activities where there's a real information gap, for example, and then paying real attention to the language they're producing. It's a kind of constant feedback loop. That's one of the benefits of making space in the classroom for some unplugged learning, because we're constantly listening to real communication, real language needs, to the real gaps and the real possibilities in our students' abilities. Hedvig, you've reappeared.
Yes, I just have something to add to this, and to talk a little bit about the fact that how we moved away beautifully from being natural and artistic to constructions and boxes and you know, science, towards science. And when we have a look at, for instance, so we have all these beautiful approaches, not necessarily methods, but approaches to teaching. And for instance, you can take amazing courses that help you to become a better reader, for instance, offering you amazing techniques, working, you know, like to find the what is the main idea of the text, how to do that, what is interesting for you, offering you amazing mentor techniques to improve your memory. However, until we have exams that asks you questions, and this is something that happened to me not too long ago. I was taking an exam, and one of the questions asked me to remember the exact percentages of Americans who believe in a punishing God. So when, you know, I'm learning those amazing techniques, teaching me how to become a better reader, but like this kind of information really is so against these techniques, you know, like what is natural, how we naturally learn, because it's too scientific, so too data-based. And so those should keep up with how we function. And we should keep in mind both our natural side and scientific or theoretical side as well.
I think that's true, Hedvig. Thank you for that. And I think it's worth bearing in mind that the emphasis placed on, for example, a more natural approach to many disciplines, including teaching, or a more spontaneous one, versus a more data-based approach, is it kind of depends on the historical context. Right now, there's a very strong cultural impetus behind data, you know, big data, data-driven outcomes, etc. If you look at some of what are called alternative educational approaches, it's interesting to see that some of the ones that we might have learned about as novice educators in language, pardon me, there's a kind of cluster of them that were all developed in the 60s and the 70s in a different cultural context, one that was more exploratory, that was more focused on, I guess, the human experience rather than data. So yeah, I think it's interesting to think of these things in their historical context. There's a nice comment here, I don't want us to miss that in the chat, from Naman, who writes, sure, we don't need to be a full servant for the chosen syllabus, which I think it's a nice way of expressing the fact that we do have choice in our teaching lives. We may not have complete choice, because in almost every scenario, there will be content that we have to cover and exams that we have to aim for. But we don't have to simply be a servant. That's a lovely way of putting it, Naman. We can express our own free will as teachers and find those spaces to let the students express themselves. Laura, the first aim is to have students engaged. Yeah, important that they're not bored.
Look, can I ask you?
Hi, Gabby.
Right. I have a tricky question, I think. Is Dogme really kind of embracing the unpredictable in the classroom? I mean, is teaching and Unplugged really coming to terms with unpredictability? Or is there a space for planning? Because, I mean, you are fully aware that there were many voices, critical voices saying, you know, Dogme means winging it. You don't need to plan, don't plan, no post books. And don't get me wrong, because I really believe in teaching Unplugged. Okay, I'm just playing the devil's advocate here.
Sure.
So the point I'm trying to make is, what's the role of planning in teaching Unplugged? Is it really just unpredictability and getting ready for what may happen in the classroom, or can we prepare for this?
I think it's a bit of both. I know there were problems with the visuals at the start, so I'm going to use a pencil and paper to try and show what I showed in the slides that I don't think were visible. I'm just going to scribble and put it in front of the camera. Whoops, and now my pencil's broken.
That's truly Unplugged,
truly
right?
Unplugged.
Unplugged. And also, you know, the reason why I'm asking, I'm going to be cheeky now. The reason why I'm asking is because I watched, well, years ago, about 8-10 years ago, I watched a couple of your lessons because, you know, I kind of followed you a lot. I was almost a stalker. So I watched a couple of your lessons, and to be honest, you never gave me an impression of someone who had not planned for that lesson. So what I'm saying is that within the lesson, there was an explicit, there was explicit teaching of language exponents that obviously you generated, but very often I felt that students were manipulating into producing a particular kind of language that you had planned before the lesson. So the point I'm also trying to make is, how is it different from TBL? Because if you plan your Dogme lesson, and when I say plan, I mean if you bring in the right prompts, if you ask the right questions, as an experienced teacher, you know very well where you are taking your students. So in a sense, that's being spontaneous. In a sense, it's unpredictable what students are going to say. Yet, just like in task-based learning, you are creating a scenario for students to produce the kind of language that you want them to produce. Okay, so then you can teach this language in a very explicit way, using the PPP approach almost. So you deal with the meaning, form, and pronunciation. That's how you dealt with it very, very swiftly. It was lovely to watch you, but I just didn't feel that it was totally unplanned, and the unpredictability was the main, I don't know, feature of the lesson.
Okay. Well, I don't know what lessons
sorry.
you watched. No, it's fine. It's a good question. I'm pretty sure that they were genuinely I wasn't manipulating the students in terms of trying to get them to come up with certain language. So I was responding to the language that emerged, and that would be my usual practice. The visual that I was going to rehearse, I don't know if everyone can see this, we're back to basics. In the standard, you might have heard me talking about this kind of orthodox methodology favored by most education systems, content is top down, it's mandated by the syllabus, whoops, my glasses are falling off, and the course book. We plan in advance in a very detailed way, sort of plan every moment of the lesson. So there's barely any space for anything that might happen spontaneously. And we often think of things going wrong, you know, in terms of, rather than thinking them as opportunities. And the timing is very, very deliberate. You know, sometimes I see lesson plans where activities are timed to 2 minutes. It's crazy. You should never time an activity for less than 5 minutes. There you go. That's me being didactic. An unplugged lesson is less strictly timed. It allows for bottom-up themes to emerge and bottom-up language to emerge. And then crucially, because we're dealing with emergent language, there's a mapping process involved. In other words, as well as looking and paying attention to what students are saying in the moment, we can make notes and review them after the lesson and then come back to them the next day. This is what I mean by a feedback loop. That's where the desire path idea becomes relevant, because we're looking at user needs and we're then responding to them. The final image I showed in this series was, I'm going to hope this is my last pencil, was all about a blended approach where we plan some things but leave space for others. So you're right, I wouldn't ever go into a classroom without any idea of what I was going to do. I might have quite a clear idea of what I was going to do. I might have an idea of where it could lead, but I would make sure that I was open to it going in other directions. I think we forget that a plan can mean many different things. It's been sort of formalized in education into something extremely detailed and carefully timed. Let's imagine, to use another analogy, something I need to do later, which is go to the supermarket to get some food. Yeah. If I went into the supermarket with literally no idea of what I was going to get or why I was getting it, I don't know what I'd do. I'd probably wander around and then buy lots of sweets. I don't know. I might be asked to leave by the supermarket staff because I looked so bewildered and confused. There are different ways that people plan their trips to the supermarket. Some people write out everything in minute detail, just as some people follow a recipe in a very detailed way when they're cooking and get the temperature of the oven right and they weigh the ingredients. But other people might just have a plan which was, you know, some fish and vegetables for supper. That's still a plan. It's still helping me cut out huge bits of the supermarket that I don't need and focus me on finding the best fish and the best vegetables. So by analogy, I think a plan can be light. I think a plan can have room for spontaneity and improvisation. I would never go into a classroom or a talk without an idea of what I was going to do. I'm very visual. I like to write things down. So I tend to have something written down, and it would have almost like it could be like a flow, a lesson flow, which is a nice alternative to a lesson plan, where you think, I'll start with this activity. There might be arrows leading in 2 directions. It might go that way to a language focus, or it might go that way to something different. I'm just looking at some of these. I hope that helps a little bit, Gabby.
Oh,
I'm
yes.
looking
yes,
now at some of the.
Yes, of course. Yeah, I guess this should also help newly qualified teachers once they understand that Dogme is not just going in there and improvising all the way through, that you can actually anticipate the emergent language, so you can get ready for feedback, for error correction. It kind of gives you confidence, right, as a newly qualified teacher. Sophie touched on this as well. So yeah, so I think we should just end it here. You know, all this talk about Dogme and no planning, because that's not what it is, right?
No, yeah, thanks for that. Sort of planned, and Amanda summarizes, but without knowing exactly what way it would go. Amanda, I'm just going to reply to you because you mentioned video.
maybe Amanda wants to talk. Look,
Please.
it may actually be faster if she wants to. It's easy to say things. Amanda, are you ready?
The point about the McDonald's activity, Amanda. Hey, Amanda.
Yeah, hi. The first time I heard about Unplugged, it must have been back in the early 2000s. And I remember searching for it on YouTube, and I found this video. I'm pretty sure it was the napkins of McDonald's.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, where you got the students sitting down and you gave them out that napkin and their faces. And what you got out of that lesson, I had the impression that when you walked in, you had an aim and you wanted them to produce a language and you guided them without them realizing, which that for me is the main idea.
It's really interesting. I didn't. Let me show everyone that activity because it's still one of my favorites.
I loved it.
And I think it will help to show what I mean by sort of light task design. So the idea was, as a teacher, I think it's very easy to do what we've been talking about. In other words, especially the more experience you get, you can kind of lead students to where you want to go, even without it being explicit. But I think more interesting is to see where they want to go. And to see where they want to go, you need to give them a choice. And my idea with this activity was to give as many students as possible a way into a conversation. Now, in this case, the subject of the conversation kind of was McDonald's. I gave everyone a McDonald's napkin, and on the board, I drew 4 squares. Yeah. And I said, you have a choice now. You can either write, whoops, okay, I won't bother scribbling with my pencil. I said, you can either describe the napkin. I gave everyone an actual napkin from McDonald's. Could have been from anywhere. You can either describe the napkin. What is it? What does it look like? What color is it? Very literal. I said, or you can talk about a memory you have of going to McDonald's, or you can write down or note down an opinion about McDonald's, or you can make something with a napkin. So I gave them 4 choices. What I was trying to do there was to give every student a way into the theme. So the first one might be very literal. It's a white napkin, but even the word napkin is pretty hard to reach. You get quite a lot of language out of that. Write a memory. If you're in the mood maybe to think about the past, to talk about yourself, friends and family, all kinds of things come out of there. But maybe you're not in that mood. Maybe you want to write an opinion. And as teachers, we often kind of plan things around, healthy eating or the environment. Maybe someone does want to talk about those issues when it comes to McDonald's. Maybe they think it's great. Let's see what their opinions are. And the 4th one was literally make something with a napkin. I had students making a paper hat, but actually the activity of folding, making, sometimes liberated them. So once they'd made it, they then started to write something down relating to one of the other questions. So the idea of that activity was to give students choice. I didn't know where it was going to lead. And the kind of themes that can come out of that, it might be that they start to remember going to McDonald's with someone in their family who's no longer with us. And suddenly you're in an area which demands, A, some different language, and B, a different approach as a teacher. And it gives people a chance to contribute in different ways.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But because you went in and you gave them 4 choices, you had pre-thought those 4 choices, right? So in a way, you knew more or less, you knew that all the students did, some would take 1, 2, 3, and 4. You would go down the 4 paths. And you can more or less anticipate. You can't anticipate exactly what, but you know more or less where it's going to go.
I don't know about that. I certainly agree that I was giving them 4 paths. where very often I think activities essentially give students one path. But I think people are so unpredictable, and people's experiences are so different that I think it's impossible to know what people are going to say or do or think in relation to an activity, providing you're not making the rules of the activity too narrow. Pardon me.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Amanda.
Look, I have one more question. Okay, I
Okay.
mean, I have millions, but look, you still have 2 more sessions lined up, so I can ask the questions later. But I have this one question because it actually is about the same session that Amanda was just questioning you about. And it's to do with error correction. So it really sounds like we are going to dissect your lesson in Exeter now. But when you were teaching that day, there was one thing that I noticed about your correcting students. First of all, you didn't correct at all. It was only reformulating student answers. So it's a particular way of correcting students. And I wonder if this is kind of Dogme specific, or I mean,
No.
what's your view on this?
Well,
And also, yeah, let me just ask the second kind of part of the question, and then the floor is yours. So you also focused on, you reformulated, and I don't know if it was intentional, you only reformulated the errors that were made by stronger students in the class. So there were many other errors that were made by weaker students, and you never touched those. Okay, so it almost felt like you were focusing on the stronger students. And then I wonder, was it intentional?
I'll answer the second question first. That's very interesting. It wasn't intentional, and I mean, that's really interesting. The first question, bear in mind that this was a one-off lesson. If, the lesson that we're talking about was filmed by the British Council.
Yeah.
I think it's probably still on YouTube. And I met a group of students for the first time. I don't believe they were a language class. They were students from at least one language school who were willing to take part. And the lesson was filmed as an example of a Dogme lesson. One of the sort of features of that is that I didn't get to see them again, which explains the focus on reformulation. It doesn't explain why it appears that I reformulated the stronger students. It's interesting. But in a regular environment, I would reformulate in the moment. I would try not to make error correction too heavy, but I would also make notes, both physical, pen and paper, and mental, possibly on an interactive whiteboard, doesn't matter where you make the notes, and then come back and certainly address repeated errors and ones that I thought were, if you like, within their scope to get right. And I would either do that within the lesson or very likely the next lesson. So what you miss from that one-off is the idea of the feedback loop that generates content and teaching points from lesson to lesson.
Brilliant. You know, I've always wanted to ask you this question, maybe not always, but since that lesson, so about 10 years ago when I watched it. And since then, I've just, you know, always wanted to ask. And here we go. Thank you.
All right, pleasure.